The government's consultation on their proposed reforms to the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, or SEND system, closed on May the 18th. Yet among the 39 consultation questions spread over 136 pages, one issue was notable by its absence: school admissions. Judging by the analysis in a new report by the Sutton Trust called Selective Inclusion, ignoring state school admissions policies within discussions of the SEND system is potentially a worrying oversight. Their report finds that the top 500 state secondary schools take in half as many disadvantaged pupils with SEND as the average comprehensive school, and they admit 36% fewer than live in the school's catchment area. So why are some state schools admitting far fewer pupils with SEND than other schools? Is it the job of head teachers, government ministers, or Ofsted inspectors to tackle this problem? And what do teachers and school leaders say they need from government to make sure that they can offer the best possible support to every pupil who needs it? My guests are Charlie O'Regan, the school engagement lead at the Sutton Trust and one of the authors of their new report, and Johnny Utley, an education leadership consultant and a former head teacher and CEO of a school trust. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out if school admissions is the missing piece of the SEND puzzle, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
As I covered on this podcast just a few episodes ago, the debate over the future of the SEND system is very much alive and kicking. But when you look at the government's proposed reforms, they almost entirely focus on what happens after a pupil has started at a school. That is, of course, hugely important. But Charlie, given what your research has uncovered, why is the question of which school a pupil attends also potentially a crucial part of the conversation about SEND?
That's a great question, and thank you for having us on to talk about our research. So I want to start by outlining kind of the history of Sutton Trust and admissions, and we've been looking at this topic for about 20 years now. And what we found consistently across those 20 years is that the highest performing schools in our country, and by highest performing, what we tend to mean is the top 500 state comprehensives by whatever accountability measures are kind of in at that time. Those schools don't recruit as many vulnerable children as lower performing comprehensives. That's true for children that are from disadvantaged backgrounds, which we measure by eligibility for free school meals. And it's also true for children receiving SEND support. And that's what our most recent report, Selective Inclusion, really examined. So to look at that in a bit more detail and to kind of illustrate the size of the issue that we're talking about, in the comprehensives with the highest GCSE results, 15% of pupils are eligible for free school meals. So that's compared to kind of a national average of around the low 20s, depending on which year you take it. And if you look at schools with the lowest GCSE outcomes, those schools tend to have a free school meal population of around 39%. So we can see there's a really significant difference there. And it's partly because higher performing schools are located in more affluent parts of the country. That accounts for about a third of the issue. But actually, the majority of this issue is driven by localised social segregation. And what we mean by that is that even within a catchment area, more affluent children are more likely to attend a high-performing school than their lower-income peers. So that's kind of the background in which we approached the SEND reform and the SEND crisis. And we knew that there was this issue with children from low-income families. And our instinct was that there were similar patterns to be found with children with SEND, particularly as our report Double Disadvantage in October showed that children from low-income backgrounds are more likely to have SEND and they're less likely to access the support they need to thrive. So we ran sort of the same analysis with children with SEND, and what we found was the same pattern, but to a slightly lesser extent. So what we found here is that the top schools have about 11.3% of their cohort are children receiving SEND support compared to 14.6% in all schools. So there is a gap, a national gap, and we also found a localised gap as well. And we found that top schools take about 13% fewer children receiving SEND support than the local area. So what this shows us is children with SEND are not accessing the best schools in their area. And that is a problem when we're talking about the fact that children with SEND have some of the lowest outcomes. And when you look at children with SEND who are also disadvantaged, that group really does have the lowest outcomes. I think children with an EHCP who are also eligible for free school meals, only about 7% of those children get the crossover of both English and maths. And then the final bit of that puzzle is we wanted to look at how do those two things interact? So are there differences for children with SEND from different social classes? And what we found here is really significant. So if you are a child with SEND, but you're from a more affluent family, there weren't actually any gaps in access to high-performing schools for that group of children. But the group of children that were SEND and from a lower income family, they had the biggest gap in access. So I think their gap in access was around 36% fewer children in that category. And so that shows us that for children with SEND, their socioeconomic status is just such a profound factor in their experiences in the system, not just, to do with getting their diagnosis and getting their EHCP, but even if you get all of that stuff sorted, you still then are going to struggle to access high-performing schools. And if we're thinking about, making mainstream more inclusive and really driving more children with SEND into the mainstream, we need to make sure that children with SEND have got equal access to the highest performing schools in their local area if we're hoping to kind of shift the dial on this at all.
Okay, well, those statistics definitely tell me that there is very good reason to pay attention to the admission system when thinking about SEND provision. So you might think that a government may therefore want to pay close attention to what's happening given their wider SEND reforms. Johnny, from what you've seen, has reforming school admissions been a priority for this government relative to all their other proposed changes to the SEND system, such as inclusion bases and reforming education, health and care plans?
I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is no. I recognise that it's incredibly difficult, the work that the government was attempting to tackle, given where we'd got to with SEND across the country and the complexity of it, and the feeling of so many families that they were involved in a battle with the system. So there's plenty in the white paper that I support and I can get behind. I think one of the disappointments for me with reform generally in the last couple of years is that neither the DfE nor Ofsted appear to show any interest in who attends particular schools and who doesn't, or indeed who did attend a school and no longer does. The issue that Ofsted have with inspecting inclusion is they're not asking that fundamental question, which is the starting point. Without asking that question, I don't think we can make any progress. I think from the government's perspective in terms of admissions and SEND, I don't know whether it was just too much to do that as well, on top of everything else they were doing in their minds. I think we come up against a couple of things. The fragmentation of the system is difficult, and the fact that you have so many different admissions authorities across the country now. I'm a recent Just CEO, but one of the things that I always felt was a mistake was giving multi-academy trusts the right to run their own admissions. And an awful lot of problems have come from that. Not that all issues around access to high-performing schools is to do with the trust system. There are maintained schools where it's problematic as well, but that's a huge barrier. I do see in the white paper some modest interest in admissions. So there's 2 or 3 things in there that have maybe been missed or not had as much attention. So one thing that's in there is the question around fair banding. So one of the many problems with admissions for me is where schools use fair banding, which for those who are not familiar with it, essentially it's a kind of cognitive ability test that potential pupils take in order to enter the school. The theory behind it is that it gives a representative sample. So it's not like admission like the 11 plus to grammar schools, but it does put lots of barriers in place. So, for example, in some schools that use it, you have to register to take the test. You have to turn up on a Saturday, which eliminates lots of families for whom that's a barrier, where they may not see the letter, or they may not know how to register, or they may not be able to get the child there on a Saturday. And then the second issue is that often fair banding, what happens is that the school then takes a representative sample, not of the local community, but a representative sample of those who have taken the test, which tends to mean that more affluent, more able pupils get access to the school when compared with the local catchment area. So I think there's a recognition on the part of the government, not specifically around SEND, that there is a problem with admissions. And what I would hope that we can get to in terms of debate going forward is actually the fundamental question about whether academies should be allowed to run their own admissions, because to me, that's a simple answer, and the answer to that is no.
So to summarise, this new Sutton Trust report suggests that we really do need to include admissions within these wider SEND conversations, and yet the government has seemed rather hesitant to do so up to this point. Let's now take a closer look at some of the main findings then in this report, because the statistics show that something is clearly happening under the surface in terms of pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds being much less likely to attend high-performing schools. But crucially, senior leaders were also surveyed in this report to try and find out why we have such large disparities in SEND rates between schools. The first finding that caught my eye was that schools can have different reputations for SEND provision, so that a parent may choose a particular local school because apparently it has a better reputation than other local schools for supporting pupils with SEND. Charlie, I can see reasons to be encouraged by this idea of some schools having a good reputation for SEND provision, but I can also see reasons to be very concerned about this, not least because reputations are hugely subjective by their nature. So what do you make of reputation as a driver of school choice?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, the whole concept of reputation for inclusion being something that we need to consider is just wrong. Every school should be equipped to support any student that is deemed fit for mainstream, should be able to go to any mainstream school, broadly speaking, and succeed. So I think, fundamentally, it is a concern that this is something that parents are thinking about. I think we need to think carefully about it from the parents' point of view and the school's point of view. So I think if we just think about the pressure that puts on parents to analyse and assess a school's reputation for inclusion, not all parents are going to be equally well equipped, either in terms of their expertise or indeed their time and resources, to make these really difficult decisions about whether a school can best meet their child's needs. And actually, if we really get into some of the more extreme circumstances, 1 in 6 adults in the UK is illiterate, which means that they can't read extensive admissions policies or SEND strategies. We also know that we've done some previous Sutton Trust research, which shows that parents from working classes tend to use fewer evidence sources when making their school decisions, and they do tend to rely on kind of word of mouth a bit more, whereas more affluent parents tend to read more formal documents. And so by relying on reputation from a parent's point of view, we're putting quite a lot of pressure on parents to make these decisions, and not all parents are as well equipped to make those decisions. And what's likely going to happen is that more affluent parents are making sort of savvier choices. And then aside from that again is putting quite a lot of power in the ethos and value of the school leaders. You're going to get school leaders that are in the role to do the right thing, and they are going to deliberately and intentionally be inclusive, even though, quite frankly, that is going to work against them in terms of accountability. There's massive disincentives to be inclusive. So what you're asking school leaders is to intentionally curate this reputation of being inclusive, even though that's going to make your life difficult and your role harder. And then on the other hand, you're going to get schools that don't do that, and they're going to take potentially a slightly easier route. So I think this whole concept of reputation is fundamentally wrong, puts a huge amount of pressure on parents to make a good choice, and puts a lot of pressure on school leaders as well. So yeah, I think it's really concerning, to be honest.
Johnny is a former head teacher and trust leader. Do you think it is healthy for some schools to be seen as better at SEND provision? Because presumably that means that some schools have a poor reputation, which seems like a strange thing to tolerate.
At an individual school level, one of our schools in our trust had more than double the national average for young people with EHCPs. And when we looked at where they live, only a third of them lived in the catchment area of the school. We were incredibly proud of the fact that parents trusted us with their young people, and we were delighted that we had a great reputation for being inclusive and for doing the very best for everybody. However, there is also an insidious thing that goes on, that some of that reputation came from the lived experience of parents telling other parents, which is brilliant and healthy and lovely to happen. But we also knew that some of the other neighbouring schools would communicate sometimes quite explicit messages to parents to say, we're not particularly expert in this field, but this school down the road is really good. And this goes on across the country. It's interesting, in the report, 41% of school leaders say themselves that they know that other schools discourage young people with SEND from attending. 50% of school leaders with the highest number of young people with SEND said that. I know of countless examples across the country where this happens. When Ofsted came to inspect our school, I had case studies because I'd spoken to lots and lots of the parents who'd come and had long conversations with them about what was their previous experience of the other school. And they consistently told the same story about being discouraged to attend the school that they left. So I shared that with Ofsted. But the frustration for school leaders is often the school that's doing the discouraging scores more highly on inspection than the school with the great reputation for SEND, because I think Charlie used the word curation, which I think is exactly the right word. There is an incentive in the current accountability system to curate your school role to attract as many young people as you can who are going to score more highly on national tests or make better progress or whatever, and conversely discourage others. And that continues to be rewarded, unfortunately, both in league tables and in the Ofsted inspection framework. So I think it's two things. It's healthy where a school is embracing that and doing great stuff, and parents are saying, my young person goes to this school, it's fantastic. They're really well looked after, they're really well taught. I would send your child there. That's a wonderful thing. But when it's coming from those other sources and where it's really about gaining advantage, that is really, really difficult and really problematic.
I mean, what you described there, Johnny, I think will be quite shocking to some of our listeners who assumed within a state school system that everybody is pulling in the same direction. But this almost feels like a moral issue as much as an education policy issue. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's an absolutely fair comment, yeah. I think the issue that we have fundamentally is that we live in a marketised school system. We have done for 40 years. And although many, many, many school leaders, I know so many fantastic school leaders across the country who are doing the right thing, who lead their schools brilliantly, who are inclusive, but they're doing so in spite of the system, not because of the system. And what we need to do is we've got to refocus the system. We've got to tip it the other way. You shouldn't need an accountability system to encourage you to do the right thing. And there are lots and lots of school leaders who don't. You know, they do the right thing because morally it's the right thing to do. But for those leaders or governors or whoever who are driven by external measures, then the most sensible thing to do is to tip those external measures in favour of the most vulnerable young people. And that might lead to a more inclusive system where at some point we don't need to have this conversation anymore. But at the moment, it's a vitally important conversation to have.
Charlie, your report pointed out that, quote, some schools may feel concerned that pupils with SEND may compromise their standings and therefore look to take fewer pupils with SEND. This all feels very uncomfortable for the reasons that Johnny has described, but do you think that we can say if it's all about pressure of Ofsted and league tables, etc., does that mean the blame lies with government, or should we be looking at the individual schools instead? What's your thoughts?
I completely agree with what Johnny's been talking about in terms of, you know, a lot of this dates back to the marketisation of schools in the 80s and kind of the subsequent policies that we've seen since then. I mean, ultimately, school leaders are competing for students, and that is going to get progressively worse as the numbers of school-aged children dwindle over the next 10 years. They're massively challenged in their recruitment of staff. One of the key ways that you can get staff into your school is to have a good Ofsted report, or to have classrooms that feel calm, that feel, you know, where staff can absolutely focus on delivering A-level physics or delivering, you know, English literature or whatever subject it is that really drives their passions. And so on the one hand, you've got these school leaders that are desperately trying to recruit students and recruit staff. They know that one of the best ways to do that is to get a good Ofsted report. And then they are being placed in an impossible situation because at the same time, they've got into school leadership probably because they really care about children and they want to be inclusive. I'm very hesitant to blame school leaders for the most part because I do think they've been put in a really difficult position. Having said that, it's easy to blame government, but when you are looking at policy that was implemented 40 years ago and the kind of unintended consequences of that, I don't necessarily think anyone that's in the system today is to blame, but that doesn't mean that we can't do more about it now to change it. And I do think we have opportunities now with the schools white paper to look at what are the policy changes we need to make today in terms of admissions, but also how do we continue to shape the wider environment so that those policy changes have the best chance of succeeding. And looking at accountability is absolutely going to be fundamental if we want leaders to make the right decisions because they're the right decisions and not feel torn between these two conflicting issues.
So having taken a look at the factors that might sit behind some high-performing schools being less likely to admit pupils with SEND, the report also digs into senior leaders' views on the government's proposed reforms to the SEND system. When senior leaders were asked what would most help your school to educate more students with SEND, the number one response was more teachers and teaching assistants. But that's not really part of the government's plans for reforming the SEND system. That said, other popular responses such as more specialist support with speech and language provision and support to set up and run specialist provision, such as new inclusion bases in secondary schools, that is part of the government's plans. Charlie, what do you make of these survey results? The government wants to offer more external support to schools to help them get set up for SEND provision, but the schools themselves want more teachers and teaching assistants.
Who's shocked? Absolutely no one that school leaders want more teachers and TAs, right? I think the first thing I would say is, teachers and TAs absolutely was our most popular response. That came in at about 66% of school leaders asking for that as a priority. But 58% did ask for more external staffing as well. So I do think there is a strong need for both more teachers and more TAs, and there's a strong need for external. I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, whilst the government haven't specifically talked about increasing staffing as part of their SEND reform, we know that there are other things going on in the background around teacher recruitment and retention that are going to help. And I think particularly the efforts around keeping women in their 30s in schools with better maternity systems, I think those are going to be really powerful, because actually if you look at our SENCOs, for example, they are going to be women in their 30s a lot of the time. So keeping that workforce in, those really experienced teachers, I think that is really significant and that's really welcome. In terms of teachers versus external staff, I think this is about like the foundations of a good SEND system. We know that one of the reasons schools are struggling is because children haven't been assessed, or they're waiting for CAMS to get back to them, or they have been identified as having a speech and language need, but the closest speech and language therapist is 45 minutes away, and if you haven't got a car, well, then you can't get there. All that does is that transfers extra pressure onto schools to deal with things that they are just not trained to do. You know, teachers are highly trained professionals to deliver their specific subject in a really specific pedagogy around that. They're not going to be able to be ed psychs or speech and language therapists. So if we can get that foundational support in place, what that does is that frees up our teachers to actually teach. And I think that's really powerful. So I think, realistically, we need both. We need more teachers in schools and we need external staffing. And I do think that there is evidence in the schools white paper that the government are trying to do both those things.
Johnny, from your experience as a recent trust leader, where would you say the biggest pressure points are? Is it the lack of the external support, which the government's new experts at hand service may start to help address? Or would you say the problem is just a fundamental question of staffing in schools?
Like Charlie, I'm probably going to say both. I think the experts at hand, I welcome that as an approach because it's part of a bigger picture of explicitly attempting to get schools and trusts to work together in communities and to connect to other services, which is something that's been absent for a long time. There's a long way to go on this. So an example I would use is in some parts of the country for CAMS, a young person waits 5 or 6 months for an appointment and then 4 in 10 don't turn up. And one of the problems is there's no data sharing agreements in those parts of the country. So schools don't know the appointment's happening, so they can't chase. But better still, I've never understood why CAMS don't do appointments in schools. It seems like an absolute no-brainer to me. So if this is a move, which I think it is, towards trying to join up services locally, I think it's likely to do more than it appears on the surface. I think coming to teachers and teaching, we know that the most effective intervention for any young person, particularly a disadvantaged young person or a young person with SEND, is high quality teaching. What I would love to see, we've had pupil premium for 15 years or so, which had some positive impact. Obviously, post-COVID, we're seeing these gaping gaps between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged young people opening again. I would love to see us thinking more carefully about investing more money into schools in the most disadvantaged communities. There was higher proportions of pupils with SEND explicitly to spend on teachers and teaching, because at the moment, again, there are disincentives to working in the most challenging schools. And what we need to do is we need to incentivise that for me and allow head teachers to be able to invest more in teaching. In a secondary school, typically a teacher will teach 22 hours out of 25 in the week. If in schools in the most challenging communities, that could be got down to 18 periods in 25 and allow more collaborative planning time and CPD time. I do think the impact on young people, particularly disadvantaged young people with SEND, would be potentially enormous. So I think there is some thinking to do around that, particularly as birth rates have fallen and there are fewer kids And actually, we might get to a point where we're not as short of teachers as we were. So actually incentivising the redeployment of teachers could become a really valuable policy going forward.
Finally, then, a quick word on Ofsted, because we've mentioned it already, and I was struck by how this report showed that many senior leaders who work with the highest proportion of pupils with SEND wanted greater recognition of inclusion in Ofsted inspections and in school performance tables, presumably to highlight the work they are doing with these pupils. And yet, I saw one recent analysis which found that only 11% of schools have been rated by Ofsted as below the expected standard on inclusion, which appears to suggest that almost every school is already doing a good job supporting pupils with SEND. Johnny, what do you make of this? Should we be heartened by the fact that so many schools are performing well on the new Ofsted inspections of inclusion?
We should be delighted that 90% of schools are doing a great job around inclusion, because that tells us that there isn't a crisis in inclusion in the country after all. However, there are some issues that may challenge that notion. 840,000 young people not in employment, education or training, that's 1 in 8 in the country compared to 1 in 20 in the Netherlands. 954,000 suspensions in 2023-24, up 21% from the year before. 11,000 young people permanently excluded from school. Elective home education going from 78,000 in 2019-20 to 175,000. These are all indicators that we have a serious problem with inclusion in the system. The problem that we have with the way Ofsted are inspecting is they're only looking at what goes on in that individual school with the children who are there. They're not asking that fundamental question that we referred to earlier. Who comes to this school? Who doesn't come to this school? One of the things that I and others were calling on Ofsted to do for a year in the run-up to this new framework was they say that they don't have the legal power to do this, but to request the legal power, if they don't have the legal power, to talk to parents who are not on roll. So if I was inspecting a school and I selected 15 children who used to be on the roll and not anymore and had a conversation with the parent, I would soon get an understanding of how inclusive that school is. Because if all 15 have left they've moved house, they've gone into private education because they won the lottery, they now believe in homeschooling, then fine. But if you hear the same story over and over again, which gets into the conversation earlier about reputation around SEND, then there's a problem. They have stoically refused to seek that power. The issue is in only looking and in limiting themselves to looking only at the experience of the young people who happen to attend that school. They are not looking at inclusion. And I would rather it was actually removed from the framework right now, because it's giving an entirely false perception of what's going on in the system. That's not to say that the schools that they've been into are not doing a cracking job. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there is compelling evidence that there is an inclusion crisis system-wide, and yet Ofsted is saying that 9 out of 10 are fine. Those two things, they both can't be true.
Charlie, what do you make of this tension between lots of senior leaders feeling they're not getting the recognition that they deserve, and yet Ofsted saying things seem to be pretty good in general? What's your take on this?
Similar to Johnny, really, in terms of inclusion within a curated cohort really isn't inclusion. And so if you are not considering the admissions processes of a school right at the start in year 7, and you're not looking at their admissions policy, the cost of attending that school, how well informed you're ensuring your parents are when they're making those choices, all you're really doing is you are, again, encouraging schools to curate their cohort so that it's easy to be inclusive with a more affluent, smaller SEND cohort within your school. And I think it's frankly ridiculous that we measure inclusion for a grammar school in Sevenoaks, which is a leafy part of Kent, in the same way as we might measure inclusion to an inner city school in the north. And I think, if we are not thinking about, is this school doing everything it can to serve its community, then we are not measuring inclusion. And I do recognise that that is complicated to do. The school admissions code is permissive by design. There are lots of different ways that you can design your school admissions code, and it definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to admissions. You do need to take context into account. But what we need to do is we need to find a way to understand the intention behind an admissions process. Are schools trying to be inclusive with their admissions, or are they trying to very subtly dissuade or not even thought about it? Admissions only needs to be reviewed legally once every 7 years in a school. So you might have been a head teacher there for 6 years and never even really thought about your admissions policy. So there is genuinely a lack of an awareness issue that hangs around here as well. And I think the other thing we need to think about with this, only 11% of schools aren't inclusive, is we do need to think about how that works with the achievement measure as well, because we do know that there are significant issues with the achievement measure across the schools that have been Ofsteded so far. Schools with the highest levels of disadvantage are not doing so well on that measure, primarily because the measure looks at achievement compared to the national standards. But if you are an inclusive school, you probably don't have a nationally average cohort. And so it is difficult. So it's interesting to me that a government that wants us to be inclusive and not have low expectations, which I say in speech marks, low expectations, but it's also saying everyone's really inclusive, but some schools aren't achieving very well. There's a tension there around what we actually mean by being inclusive as well. So we're not recognising schools that are genuinely being inclusive through the inclusion measurement, and we're simultaneously punishing them for being inclusive through the achievement framework as well. So, I think there's work to do. And similarly, I call strongly for Ofsted to be granted the powers to inspect admissions. Again, they don't have the legal basis to do that yet, but I think that is something that would be an obvious win to me.
Okay, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question for today. As you've both highlighted, there are many reasons to believe that the admission system is distorting SEND provision in some way, and yet the government has shown very little interest in changing the admission system to resolve the problems that have been identified in this new report from the Sutton Trust. So my question is, if you had the chance to wave your magic policy wand, which single reform to the admission system do you think would have the greatest impact on the prospects of the most vulnerable children and young people? Charlie, what would you like to change about the school admission system if you had the chance?
So currently, schools have the option to prioritise places in their school for children eligible for the pupil premium. Of the 3,000 odd secondary schools that we have in England, only about 60 have chosen to do so, despite the fact that it is supposed to attract more funding to their school. That's been the case for over 10 years now. And I think what we have to do is acknowledge that that isn't really working. And I think we need to require schools to prioritise children eligible for the pupil premium in their oversubscription criteria. And whilst that doesn't speak directly to supporting children with SEND, because we know that children from lower incomes are more likely to have SEND, that will automatically support children with SEND as well. But I do say that with a bit of a caveat, which we explored in a different report of ours called Admissions Not Impossible, which is that if we are going to require schools to do that and prioritise children eligible for the pupil premium, we do need to create the right conditions for them as well through the accountability system, so that the system doesn't compensate in another way, say, for example, having really expensive uniform that puts families off in a different way. So the policy change is the pupil premium priority. But as with all good things in schools, implementation is a process, and we need to look at the wider context as well. And we need to support that policy process so that it is successful.
Thank you, Charlie. Johnny, how would you like to reform the admission system to help the most vulnerable pupils?
Before I give my answer, just shout out to the City of York, who have been doing some brilliant work, bringing all schools into the policy that Charlie's talked about, which is really exciting work around here. Single policy change, I would remove academies' right to be their own admissions authority, return admissions to local authorities. And alongside that, and I'm cheating, the DfE really upping its game around data. There's absolutely no reason why using the single pupil identifier, we can't map where every single child in the country goes to school with their characteristics, which would start to build an intelligent data picture that may or may not be used in inspection going forward, but certainly could be used to drive policy. Because at the moment, the DfE is flying blind around data right across the piece, around suspensions, exclusions, elective home education, all the rest of it.
Thank you, Johnny. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Johnny and Charlie for sharing their views and insights on why school admissions deserves to be considered when discussing the future of the SEND system. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.